Good morning, everybody. We're live here from the birdhouse, and today we're talking about attracting orioles and hummingbirds to your backyard. And it is a very exciting time of the year when these migratory birds start to come back into the yard. And we are starting to get some reports of orioles scattered throughout the Western New York area. So if you haven't gotten any yet, don't be discouraged because they're just starting to roll in. We're just starting to get a few reports of them. I was looking through my photos last year. I didn't have any until like May 10th or so. So it took a while for me to get my first one last year. So over the next couple of weeks, they will be rolling in. So if you haven't put out your feeders, absolutely now is the time. There's lots of birds out there chatting. It is time to make sure that your houses are out. If you haven't put your bird houses out, you don't want to wait because they are looking for places to nest. Some birds are already starting to nest. And we will be hearing about more migrants coming in, not just the orioles and the hummingbirds, but rose-breasted grosbeaks will start visiting feeders as well. So we'll hear reports about them any day now as well. So as always, we love to know what kind of things you're seeing or hearing in your yard. You can put those in the comments. If you have questions, you can throw those in there, or you can always just say hi also. The birds are very, very chatty. They are singing quite a bit in the mornings. I've been hearing lots of Carolina wrens. The flickers have been singing quite a bit. Tufted titmouse, chickadees. So there's been lots and lots of activity out there. If you are local to Rochester, this is our feeder cleaning week. So if you have dirty feeders, you can bring them in anytime through Saturday afternoon for a free cleaning. You just drop them off. We will call you when they're done, and then you can pick them up. So that is going on this week. And on Thursday, we have a walk, a guided hike that we are doing of Washington Grove at Cobbs Hill Park. So for more information about any of those events and the other things we have going on here, you can always visit our website, which is thebirdhouseny.com. And if you're watching and if you've seen any Oriole activity, absolutely let us know where you are and what you've seen. So as far as where I am in Western New York, we have a couple different species of orioles. If you are out west, your orioles are different. You don't have the same species as we do. You guys have some different ones. But to attract them, it's the same kind of tips. Same kind of things will attract any kind of oriole that you'll see here. So these tips are pretty universal for orioles. So here in Western New York, we have the Baltimore Oriole, and this is the male on the left and the female on the right. So usually we hear and see the males first, and then the females start to filter in. So far, we've seen a couple pictures of male orioles and one photo of a female oriole that has been spotted so far. And this is their range. So you can see the blue is where they spend their winters. The yellow is when they're migrating through. So they just kind of pop in there briefly. They don't stick around. But then the orange is in their breeding range. So that's where they will stay throughout the summer. Usually they start going back down south around August or so. We start to hear that they're no longer in backyards. So you can attract them throughout the summer, and I'll give you some tips on how you can keep them coming all season long. So that is their breeding range, and that breeding range extends up into Canada. We also have what's called the orchard oriole, and the male, which is on the right, is quite a bit darker in color. So they're a much darker bird. The females can look very similar to the Baltimore Oriole females. The juveniles, I don't know if I have, this is the juvenile orchard oriole. Looks quite a bit different than all of them. So they can look pretty variable from the Baltimore Oriole, but the males are quite a bit darker. So these will sometimes come to bird feeders. We mostly hear about Baltimore Orioles coming to bird feeders, but every once in a while, we do get a report of an orchard oriole coming to a feeder, especially early in the season when they're migrating through. And this is their breeding range, or their range. You can see where they spend the winter. That's in the blue. So they're down in Mexico and Central America. They will migrate up through Mexico. And then here in Western New York, we are at the kind of the northernmost tip of their breeding range. So not as common as the Baltimore Oriole, but you can find them around here in the Western New York area. As far as Orioles go, sometimes you can hear them before you see them. Usually that's the case with me. You can hear their high-pitched whistles high up in the trees because they do like to be found high up in leafy deciduous trees. Not usually in deep forest. They kind of like the open woodland or forest edges. So any kind of transitional habitat in between forests and a different habitat, whether it be a wetland or a grassland, that is a good place to look for Baltimore Orioles. They'll forage for insects and fruits in brush and in shrubs. They often drink nectar from blooms, and they're common in backyards. So if you have any kind of blooming trees right now, that can attract Orioles too. So it's not just feeders that they'll come to. They will absolutely come to blooming plants and trees. In the spring and in the fall, nectar and ripe fruits compose more of their diet. But in the summer, while breeding and feeding their young, much of their diet consists of insects. This is what the Oriole nest looks like. And if you go out in any kind of park, or if you go hiking anywhere, right now, before the leaves come out on the trees, you can probably see some of these nests hanging. They build a hanging nest. They weave a hanging nest from branches of the tree. The female will choose the nest site within a territory that's defended by her mate. She'll anchor the nest firmly to a fork in the slender upper branches of a tree. It's usually overhanging too. It's usually not in the middle of the tree, and it's a branch that's overhanging, whether it be the trail or the distinctive nest usually hangs below a branch, but is sometimes anchored along a vertical tree trunk. The female weaves the nest, usually 3 to 4 inches deep, with a small opening about 2 to 3 inches wide. And the bottom, where the eggs will rest, usually ends up to be 3 to 4 inches across. And this only takes about a week for the female to do. Last year, one of the hikes that we led, we were lucky enough to watch as a female Oriole was weaving together her nest, and that was really, really cool. So it does not take very much time at all for them to build this neat hanging nest here. The clutch, as far as how many eggs they lay, is 3 to 7. So they'll lay anywhere between 3 to 7 eggs. And just like most other birds, the older and more mature the female is, the more eggs she will lay. They only have 1 brood per year. She'll sit on those eggs for 11 to 14 days. That's the incubation period. And then after those couple of weeks, those eggs will hatch, and the nestlings will be in that nest for about 2 more weeks until they are out into the world. So the whole process does not take very long at all. And here's a couple more pictures of Oriole nests. This is the orchard Oriole nest. Looks a little bit different than the Baltimore Oriole nest. One of the best ways to attract Orioles to your backyard, if you don't have flowering trees or flowering shrubs, is a feeder. And Baltimore Orioles are fairly easy to attract. In fact, people have been having much more luck attracting Orioles than hummingbirds in recent years. So pretty easy to attract. They'll come to suet, they'll eat oranges, they'll drink nectar, they'll eat mealworms, but their absolute favorite is jelly. So if you're only going to put out one type of food, jelly is the way to go. And they prefer grape jelly. I'll show you some of the different jellies we have too. So male and females will definitely come to feeders pretty readily, especially early on in the season when they're migrating through. They're hungry and they are looking for calories to load up to either continue on their migration or to refuel from their long flight. And keep in mind that these birds migrate overnight. So in the mornings, they're very hungry. So making sure that your feeders are full in the mornings are important, because they will stop at dawn to refuel and feed throughout the morning. And then they usually kind of hunker down for the day. So as far as suet goes, Orioles do eat suet. It's not the number one thing that they'll come to out of all the feeders, but they will come to it, especially if you switch out to orange suet this time of the year. So this time of the year, I always pull the kind of suet that I usually feed and we'll replace it with orange suet, just as a good way to entice Orioles if they're around. I like to give them as many options as possible in the backyard. Another thing are oranges. Super simple way to feed Orioles. You can cut an orange in half. Doesn't need to be put on anything fancy. I've seen people stick them on fences, on wire fences, any kind of small spike. You can just spike the orange right on there. And the Orioles will usually eat the whole inside of the orange pretty quickly. So super simple way to attract them with oranges. Nectar is another thing you can do. You can make your own nectar using sugar and water, using just white granulated sugar. The recipe is 1 part sugar to 5 parts water. Just like your hummingbird nectar, you can boil the water, add the sugar, let it cool, and let it settle, and fill your feeders up. We also have the easy to mix nectar. You just add water to. We have also nectar that you can just pour right into the feeder. So we've got all kinds of different options as far as nectars go. So nectar is another way to attract them. They will drink that. But really the best thing you can do, like I said, if you're only going to give them one food, jelly is the way to go. And the thing we sell the most of is this birdberry jelly. It's a mix of grape and blackberry. There's no preservatives. There's no corn syrup in there. And so it's completely healthy for the birds. If you do buy your jelly at the grocery store, you just want to make sure that there's no high fructose corn syrup or artificial flavorings or anything like that in your jelly. So just want to read the labels when you are feeding the jelly to the birds to make sure it is healthy for them. But we have all kinds of different jelly. We've got 3 different types here now that you can feed the Orioles. So we are fully stocked with jelly for all your Orioles in the backyard. And then they'll also eat mealworms, especially as the season goes on. And once those eggs hatch, they will feed their nestlings a lot of insect protein. So the trick to keeping the Orioles coming in your yard all season long is to also add mealworms to your repertoire as the season goes on. So it's usually around early to mid-June is when they start to kind of disappear from backyards. It seems you might have them coming with some regularity. You might see them every day, really often. And then all of a sudden they become more sparse. We hear that all the time because they are sitting on the eggs, or perhaps those eggs have hatched and they are out hunting for insects to feed their nestlings. So one thing that you can do in order to keep them coming is to put out mealworms. So we have both live and freeze-dried mealworms. Our live mealworms should be in actually today. And they prefer the live, just like the bluebirds. The Orioles prefer the live mealworms, but they'll also eat the freeze-dried mealworms. So you just add a little bit of, you can spray the freeze-dried mealworms with a little bit of water, makes them look a little bit more appetizing for the birds. And that's one way that you can keep the Orioles coming with some more regularity. Oriole feeders come in all different styles. Usually there's some type of a cup feature in it for you to put the jelly in. These 2 styles here, one is called the Ultimate Oriole Feeder. That's on the left. That is a pretty big one. And then there's the Oriole Fest Feeder on the right. That's our best seller. They both allow you to put oranges on them, jelly on the top of the feeder, and then inside you can put nectar. So this allows for you to put 3 different types of the Orioles food all in one feeder, which is really nice. So these are really good sellers because of that. These are also really good if you don't want to deal with the nectar, or you might have a hummingbird feeder that you'll put the nectar in. Sometimes Orioles will come to those feeders, but I'll show you the differences between the Oriole and the hummingbird feeders as far as nectar goes in just a moment. If you're just going to feed nectar, or if you're just going to feed jelly and oranges, these are awesome. They allow you to spike the oranges on the sides. You can fill the cups full of jelly, and they both have little roofs on them too, which act as weather guards, which is really good for the Oriole jelly, especially because if we have a rainy day, it can wash out all of the jelly and you might not get as many Orioles coming. So you can always add a weather guard, and I'll show you those also. Here's a couple other examples of Oriole feeders. The one on the left is really popular. Looks like a little flower. It allows for them to perch. And that's going to be the biggest difference between Oriole and hummingbird feeders. I can show you these actually are good examples. Oriole feeders that have nectar, that provide nectar for the birds, have larger perches and larger feeding ports. Because the Orioles are a larger bird, they do require some perching room. Hummingbirds will use perches, but they don't necessarily need them. They'll just hover when they feed. And Orioles don't do that. So Orioles do require that their feeder has a perch on it. So especially with these two, you can really see that there's nice large perches on the feeders for the Orioles to land on. The other thing, which is hard to see here, is that the feeding ports for the nectar are also larger. Hummingbirds have really small bills, so they can stick their bills in to really small hummingbird feeders that have small feeding ports, but Orioles need a larger feeding port. So any kind of Oriole feeder that allows for nectar will have larger feeding ports so they can stick their beaks in. We hear all the time that Orioles will sometimes come to hummingbird feeders or try to come to hummingbird feeders, but they just can't fit their beaks into them because their bills are just that much wider. There are, we'll get to feeder accessories later, but you also might see other visitors that are coming to your Oriole feeder, which is really exciting. Not only will Orioles come to the jelly, but you might get this bird. I tend to get this bird first before I see any Orioles. This is a gray catbird. Gray catbirds love the jelly, especially. They'll also eat the oranges. So you might see them coming to the feeder. They're another migratory bird. They're in the mimicking family, so they'll mimic the calls of other birds, but at the end of their repertoire of mimicking other birds, they'll make a sound that sounds like a little meow, and that's what gives them their name. You might also see mockingbirds. Mockingbirds will eat the jelly. They'll also come for the oranges. So you might see either of these in your backyard coming to your Oriole feeders. And then we get reports of things like house finches sometimes, cardinals sometimes eating the jelly. You never know. Each yard's a little bit different. But you just might get these two coming to your feeders on top of the Orioles. So even more diversity in the backyard. And our other migrants that you can attract to your backyard this time of the year are hummingbirds. And we have the one species of hummingbird here on the East Coast called the ruby-throated hummingbird. And no reports yet of ruby-throated hummingbirds. Usually it's around May 5th here that we start hearing reports of hummingbirds. And then around the 12th or 13th, around Mother's Day, we like to say, that's when they're really starting to come in some larger numbers. So you still have a little bit of time to get ready for the hummingbirds, but I'd have your feeder out by next week or so just to be ready for them. You can see that they spend the winter in Mexico and Central America. They'll migrate up through Mexico, and then all through the eastern U.S. there is their breeding range. So that's where they'll spend all spring, all summer, and then they tend to go back down south around Labor Day or so. So usually early September, they start to make that migration back down south. Hummingbirds, you can find them kind of all over the place. You can find them in old fields, forest edges, meadows, orchards, stream borders, backyards, and their tropical wintering grounds. They live in dry forests, citrus groves, hedgerows, and in scrubs. So hummingbirds have kind of a diverse habitat when they are up here in their breeding range. They feed on the nectar of red and orange tubular flowers such as trumpet creeper, cardinal flower, honeysuckle, jewelweed, bee balm, morning glory. If you have some flowers that seem to attract hummingbirds, absolutely put them in the comments. They also will eat insects. So they're known to catch insects in midair or even pull pull insects off of spider webs or go after the spiders themselves. And they'll use the silk from spider webs to help make their nest and keep their nests together. So I like these pictures. Here's a picture of a hummingbird going after a honeybee. And then also on the right there, you can see a picture of the hummingbird's really long tongue. So if you look at some hummingbird feeders, sometimes it looks like, how on earth do they feed from those? They have really long tubes. How on earth can the hummingbird even feed from them? Not only does the hummingbird have a really long bill, but they also have a really long tongue, so they can dip it deep into the feeders. This is a little hummingbird nest. The females will build their nests usually on a slender descending branch. There are ads out there for hummingbird houses, but hummingbirds are not cavity nesters, so they do not use hummingbird houses. So you don't want to be fooled by that, but they will nest on small platforms and on branches. The size of the nest is very, very small. It starts off about the size of a thimble, and they prefer to nest on a branch that is forked. And so there are some things called hummingbird perches that mimic little forked branches. We do have a couple of those, so that's an option if you're trying to attract hummingbirds to nest. We do have little, almost like hummingbird nesting platforms. The nest itself is made of thistle or dandelion down, and it's held together with strands of spider silk. They'll also use lichen from the sides of trees to put on the outside of the nest to help camouflage it. Their eggs are very, very small. They're only about the size of Tic Tacs or so. They're about ½ an inch long. They will lay anywhere between 1 and 3 eggs. Usually it's 2, and they'll have 1 to 2 broods a year. They will sit on the nest for 12 to 14 days, and the nestlings will be in that little nest for about 3 weeks, anywhere between 18 and 22 days. And as the nestlings get larger, the nest kind of stretches out. So the nest starts out super, super small, about the size of a thimble, but then it'll stretch out a little bit as the nestlings grow. Attracting hummingbirds is pretty easy. They will drink nectar, and you can make your own nectar just like you can make your own Oriole nectar. The recipe for nectar is 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. So it's going to be more sweet than the Oriole nectar. And you don't want to add any dyes. Sometimes you'll see that hummingbird feeders or the hummingbird nectar will be red, but it's said not to use any kind of dyes or food coloring when you're making your hummingbird nectar, because it's not known if the dyes can harm the birds in any way. They don't need it, so you don't have to add that to your nectar. We have ready-to-use nectar, which I love. Super easy. You can just pour it into the feeder. And we also have nectar concentrates you just add water to. So we have all kinds of different hummingbird nectar options here. Hummingbird feeders are pretty simple. They are just some type of reservoir to hold the nectar. Here in the East Coast, because we have just the one species, you don't even need a feeder that's too big. Sometimes they're very, very large feeders that hold a lot, but you really don't need one that large. And because the nectar needs to remain fresh, your best bet is to get a small feeder that you just refill often instead of a large feeder that you would fill infrequently. So you want to make sure that to keep the nectar fresh by refilling it every 2 to 4 days. Make sure to check it that it's not getting moldy. Anytime you go to refill it, you want to at least rinse out the feeder. You might want to wash it every week or more. Just keep an eye on it, because if it starts to get moldy or if the nectar is getting cloudy quickly, that's a sign that you do want to clean your feeder. I should also mention that the color red does bring in hummingbirds. So if you're trying to attract hummingbirds for the first time, I would recommend getting a feeder that is red. You don't want to dye the nectar red, but having the feeder red is really good because that will draw them in. There are different feeder accessories also that you can add. These are weather guards that you can add above your Oriole feeder or above your hummingbird feeder. We do have them in bright red also. The bright red ones for hummingbird feeders do help bring the hummingbirds in, because again, it's a big red beacon basically to help bring them in. So if you have a hummingbird feeder and it's not red, you can always add a red weather guard to the top of it to help bring them in. I put these orange weather guards above my Oriole feeders to keep the nectar, or to keep the jelly from washing out during the rain. That makes a big difference. So we usually find that if people buy a Oriole feeder without a weather guard, they usually come back to buy one after the fact, because once it starts raining, the nectar gets very, very washed out. This is also clutch. This is what's called an ant moat, or sometimes they're called nectar protectors. This is something that hangs above your feeder, and you fill it with water. It's just a little cup. And the idea is that ants, when they're walking down down the pole or whatever you have your feeder hanging from, when they're walking, they're on their way down to the feeder, they can't get around this moat of water to get down to the feeder to drink the nectar. So if you don't have one of these, you might find that insects, especially ants, crawling insects, are getting into the feeder. They're floating in there. That can make the nectar moldy. So putting up an ant moat like this will really limit that. And this is, not only does this help keep the ants out, but smaller birds like chickadees and especially goldfinches will use this as a little bird bath, which is really cute. We also have what's called feeder fresh, and this will keep your nectar fresh longer. So I mentioned you want to make sure to change the nectar out every 2 to 4 days or so. If you're unable to do that, or if that's just difficult for you to do, I would absolutely recommend this product. It's called Feeder Fresh Nectar Defender. You add just a little bit to your nectar, and it's all natural micronutrients that will keep the nectar fresh for more like a week or 10 days. And people use this a lot too if they're traveling, if they're going on vacation and they can't, or if they don't have somebody to refill their feeders or take care of their feeders. You can just put this in your hummingbird nectar and you don't have to worry about it getting moldy while you're away. We also have gel that'll keep ants out. This is something that smells like cinnamon and clove, and the ants just don't like that smell. You just put a little line of this gel around the pole that your hummingbird feeder is hanging from, and the ants won't cross that barrier. So this has to be reapplied, but this works really, really, really well. We have a lot of customers that swear by this, and it does absolutely work. And then there's such things as bee guards. So bee guards will go on the inside of some feeders, not every feeder, but a lot of feeders do allow for bee guards that we carry. As far as Oriole feeders go, we have one feeder called the Oriole Fest, which is our bestseller, which is actually, that's my background picture of the Oriole there, is the Oriole Fest feeder. And that allows for the bee guards to go inside. They're just little rubber tips, and you put them on the inside of the nectar ports here. They just kind of snap on there. And the idea with these are that the birds can poke through the nectar guards to get down into the nectar, but bees and wasps can't penetrate it. So not only do we have these for this specific Oriole feeder, but several of our hummingbird feeders also allow for the nectar guard tips, especially the Humzinger feeders by Aspects. Those all allow for nectar guard tips that you can add. So there are ways to keep the bees and wasps out, even the ants. So there are some things that you can do. As far as attracting Orioles and hummingbirds to your yard, right now is the time to get your Oriole feeders out. Make sure they're out now. Like I said, we've had some scattered reports of Orioles in the area. We haven't gotten the big push yet. It's usually about this week when we start to hear the first reports of Orioles. We heard some last week. And then once we get that big push, we'll get a lot of phone calls about it. So we'll know what day they're really starting to come back. But over the next couple of weeks, we'll really start to get waves of Orioles in. So if you don't see them right away, don't get discouraged. Like I said, last year, I didn't have mine until like May 10th or 12th. So it took a while for me to even get my first one. So it can take a little bit of time. It's not an exact science. Make sure to stock up on jelly. Places can run out, especially if you buy it at the grocery store. Anytime the Orioles first get into town, it seems like all the shelves get wiped out of jelly every single year. Add a weather guard to help preserve your jelly. That'll absolutely help. switch to mealworms in June to help keep those Orioles coming. And make sure for the Orioles and the hummingbirds to change your nectar out frequently. That can make a really big difference. You don't want that nectar to get moldy. So it looks like there are some comments here. Cindy's on, says, good morning to everybody live. Jen is on saying good morning. Our bluebirds have finished building their nest. Any day now, we just start seeing eggs. It will be our 3rd year with nesting bluebirds. How exciting. Cindy says, I'm planning on doing your Thursday bird walk. My first bird walk with you. Looking forward to it. I'll be hoping for good weather. Yes, fingers crossed for good weather. Thursday morning, we will be having a guided walk over at Washington Grove, which is in Cobbs Hill Park. We'll be meeting at the Nunday Boulevard entrance. So absolutely meet us out. It should be a good day. And for more information on that, you can visit our website, which is thebirdhouseny.com. Michelle says, our bluebirds have pink eggs. Very interesting. I would take a picture of that and send it in. That's really neat. They usually have bluish eggs. Let's see. Kimberly says, can I use my leftover hummingbird syrup from last year if it has been refrigerated? Possibly, but I would get new. It's so easy to make. I would just err on the side of caution with that and make some new. The jelly, the Oriole jelly, can sometimes last. Sometimes it gets a little crystallized. So your jelly, if it's been refrigerated, might be okay. But the leftover syrup, I would just make some new because it is just so easy to make. I would just get rid of the old stuff and start fresh just to be safe. Okay. So Jennifer has some recommendations here for hummingbird plants. Fuchsia, I don't know if I'm going to be saying this right, Cuphay, red salvia, zinnias have all done really well for me on hummingbirds. So she's got some recommendations there on plants for hummingbirds. So that's awesome. Cindy says, I never knew that hummingbirds were such aggressive fighters. I learned that on a bird walk a couple of years ago. Amazing little birds, power packed in a very tiny body. Yes, so hummingbirds are pretty territorial. So the key to attracting multiple hummingbirds, if you're trying to get several to your backyard, is to get multiple feeders. I would get multiple little ones. You don't need, like I said, you don't need really large feeders. Multiple feeders in locations that are kind of away from one another where they can't see one another, because they do defend their habitat. They do defend their food source. So I would absolutely put out multiple feeders in places where they can't really see one another, and that can really help. Cindy says, Liz, you have some beautiful hummingbird feeders in your store. I saw them displayed during the past week with your 30th anniversary celebration. Yeah, we had a very busy week last week with our 30th anniversary celebration. Thank you guys all who came out. We raffled off hundreds of items, and people are still picking those up, and we'll be doing that again next month. We'll be having another raffle. We'll let you know when that is. And we also were able to raise a lot of money for some nonprofits. We had 5 different nonprofits in the store throughout the week, and 10% of that day's sales went to the nonprofit. So we were able to make a lot of nonprofits happy. So thank you guys all who came out and shopped to support a cause. That means a lot to those nonprofits. So we had a lot of fun last week with our 30th anniversary. Thank you for coming out. Heidi says, hi, we usually get the Baltimore Orioles first, and then the Orchard Orioles show up a little later, but I also love seeing the catbirds. They sound like a young kitten meowing, LOL. Yes, they definitely do. They've got that little meow call at the end of their repertoire of songs. They'll do their little meow. So Heidi gets the Baltimore Orioles first and then the Orchard Orioles. So very cool. Lynn says, I have my jelly ready. I really hope I don't have the house sparrows taking over like last year. Yeah, it seems like every once in a while the house sparrows can get a sweet tooth for the jelly. I had a couple eating some of mine out that I put out the other days, but it was just a couple. So I'm hoping that they just kind of move on and don't get really too used to it. But thankfully, it's only just a couple. Virginia says, I get a black and bloom salvia every year for hummingbirds. Sometimes the garden centers will call it black and blue salvia. Also Monarda, aka bee balm. Yeah, bee balm is a really good one for the hummingbirds. They do love the salvias. So thank you, Virginia, for those recommendations. It looks like that's everybody's comments and questions for the day. Like I said, if you are in the Rochester area, we do have our bird feeder cleaning event going on this week. You can drop off your feeders any day this week through Saturday. So the big event, the big cleaning is on Saturday, where we set everything up out front of the store and scrub those feeders, but we're working on them all week long. And you can drop them off and we will call you as soon as they're done. And we'll be back on Saturday with another live stream. Maybe some of you will have Orioles by then. So if you do, absolutely snap some photos, send them in to us so we can share your sightings, and keep us posted about when you do get your Orioles so we can let everybody know. And we'll be back on Saturday with another broadcast. And until then, have a great week, and hope to see some of you on Thursday at the Birdwalk. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.